I wanted to put together this webinar. Thank you everyone for joining. I wanted to put it together. I'm working with a client right now, obviously, like, companies all over the world. They've been forced to go into a fully remote way of working, and it's a challenge, right? And there are some things that we're doing there around doubling down on our Scrum fundamentals that are really paying off. And I wanted to put some of that learning together and share it with other people in hopes that some of it can pay off for you as well. So as we get started, we'll get some of the logistics out of the way first. So first thing, who am I? My name is Daniel Lynn. I'm an Agile coach and trainer with Agile 42. I'm based out of Denver, Colorado. If you need anything coming after this, right, please feel free to reach out to me by my email or on Twitter. And who is Agile 42? So Agile 42, we're a training and coaching company. We are international. I know we have people from all over the world on this call, so I want to thank everyone for joining, but especially the people who are already well into their evening and are taking the time to join us on this webinar now. Thank you very much. Little bit of logistics. So I would love for everyone to ask questions whenever something comes up. If you just type them in chat, I asked Wayne to be here with me and help me out. So he's going to kind of keep an eye on chat and record those questions, so you don't need to wait until a certain time to post them. And then there will be a number of times throughout this webinar where we will get to dig into some of the questions specific to the challenges we talk about or questions in general. Also, slides and recordings will be available after the webinar. We'll send those out and make them available online. So I know right now internet has been a little flaky for a lot of people. Everyone's online doing Zoom calls like this, right, as everyone's working from home. And so it can be a little choppy at times. Don't worry, if you miss a little thing, you can always come back, check the recording or check the slides later. So getting to the elephant in the room. We've all in recent weeks had to experience this move in our companies of going from what might look like this kind of environment where we have people in an office working together. You can turn and just talk to someone when you have a question. And we've moved to kind of this environment where we're all alone at home trying to reach out to people. And frankly, it's difficult, right? I don't think that's untrue for anyone. And one of the things that is interesting in this time is that there are some organizations out there that seem to be doing perfectly okay with this, right? They seem to be thriving just fine, despite the fact that they've moved to this type of work. And it can be very tempting to think that perhaps, hey, that's just a special kind of company. They're organized in a special way that makes it easy for them that my company couldn't do, or they only hire millennials who are used to sitting on their phones and the internet all the time anyway. So for them, hey, whatever, it's easy, nothing new. But that hasn't been my experience, right? I've worked at companies like this. I've worked with companies as a coach who are succeeding working remotely. And what I have found is that they face the same problems everyone else does. However, they found ways to tackle some of those challenges. And so that's the goal that I want to talk about. I want to talk about 3 of the most common challenges. And those challenges start with communications. Right? So communications are hard everywhere and get that much harder when we go remote. The next one is alignment. How do we keep people working in the same direction on the same things and being effective with each other as they're doing that work? And finally, the ability to adapt and pivot, right? Which is hard enough even in face-to-face, but is that much harder when you don't have that face-to-face interaction. You don't have that quick interaction with the people that you're working with or the teams that are working on these products. Now, particularly what I want to do here is talk about how Scrum addresses these 3 things, and in particular, how it can make these pain points less of a pain point when you move to remote work. So if you have a Scrum team now, you don't have to be perfect at Scrum, but if you have a Scrum team at all, the practices that I'm going to talk about are things that to one degree or another, your teams probably already do. And there's an opportunity with some of these to double down, do them more, and get more value out of them. So my hope for this webinar for all of you is that we're going to talk about 9 different concrete things, but that out of that 9, even if you have 1 or 2 that you can take back to your team, that will make working remote just a little bit easier. So let's dive in and talk about the first challenge. This first challenge is communication. And let's first talk about why is communication such a challenge when we're doing especially remote work. And it comes down to this. There's this assumption that I put in effort and I get value out of that effort. And it misses a critical piece of modern work, right? There's a lot of communication in there. If we really think about the work that happens, in order to get to value, I'm handing work off between different types of workers. I'm getting information from different places. I'm leveraging domain knowledge. I'm doing a lot of coordination between different people in order to get from that left side, the effort, over to that right side, the value, where I'm actually delivering something that I need. And so when I go remote, every single piece of communication, right, I have distractions I have to deal with. I have odd hours that people may be working. I have technical problems that we run into. I was just on a meeting today. It took 15 minutes to get started because we moved from one platform to another, to another, to another, just with all the bandwidth being used, right? Just trying to get through that. So technical problems become that much worse in this situation. And then on top of that, we move to asynchronous communication a lot, right? Whether that's emails and then we wait for that information to come back to us, or we send a message on Slack, but maybe we don't expect that message to be answered right away. So we get more asynchronous communication, which puts a lot of wait time. So it doesn't necessarily take any more time to put the effort in, but it puts all these blocks in between the bits of effort to get to value. Now, the other side of this coin that we need to consider is communication channels. We often don't talk about this a lot, but Scrum actually really has this front and center in its design. When we have just 2 people, we have 1 communication channel. If we go up to 5 people, we jump to 10 communication channels. Right at 12 people, which is not a big team for a large project, we're at 190 communication channels. So if all 190 of those communication channels become twice as difficult, that really slows things down. And for the math people, I included at the bottom of this slide our communication channel formula, right? So you can think of your project, how many people are all working together to deliver value in your project, and figure out how many communication channels they have to navigate in order to deliver that end product and get the value out of their effort. So this is the problem that we're facing. And as we go remote, this becomes more difficult, but what does Scrum have to say that helps us? Well, the first thing is we have small teams. Scrum says that the development team inside the Scrum team should be no more than 9 people, right? So that's even, if we recall from that last slide, that's even kind of getting a little high on the communication channels. But by having these small teams, we have fewer channels. And what small teams find is that arranging video conferences like this one, getting a whole bunch of people together to talk really fast becomes much easier. We've probably all ran into this, right? You get 4 people together to hang out on a Friday evening, no problem. But you try to get 10 people together or 12 or 15 people together, and suddenly matching everyone's calendars up becomes next to impossible. So by having these small teams, it's easier to manage everyone's schedule and everyone's communication. We can start forming working agreements in these small teams, and we can start having things like common hours, right? So one of the challenges that we have as we're home is things like, well, maybe my kid is doing online schooling from 10 to 12, and it's a really awful time for me to have a meeting. Well, when I have to coordinate that kind of stuff in a couple of people, that's pretty easy to do. But the bigger it gets, the harder that becomes, right? So having these small teams is a really important part of the Scrum team, right? The next thing is most communications inside of Scrum happen inside of the team, right? So if I want to deliver value with a cross-functional team, I don't have to go outside where those working agreements no longer apply, and I don't know how quickly that person's going to give me an answer, right? That's where my communications get really hairy. So if I can keep that communication inside of the team instead, that can be a really powerful benefit. We do that with cross-functional teams where all the skills necessary to deliver an increment of value exist within the team. And I want to pause on this one and point out, a lot of people think to be cross-functional, everyone on the team needs every skill. Don't try to hold yourself to that standard, right? If you're in a situation where even one major skill is missing, figuring out a way to get that skill inside the team can make all the difference, especially with these complex communications that we have while we're working remote. And the third one on this challenge is our teams need to be dedicated, right? Too often we see teams where there's a person who's in the team, but only part-time, right? They're matrix to other teams. And when we need them most, that is just by luck when they're busy with another team because that team needed them the most at that time also, right? So having dedicated teams who are cross-functional and small really smooth out these communication challenges. And I want to pause here before going on to the second challenge, just to see whether or not any questions have come up just about this challenge or these 3 Scrum fundamentals that help out with it. I'll ask Wayne to help me out here. Any questions? Okay, no problem. Let's move on to the next one. There's a time at the end, so don't feel like this is your only time to ask a question. There's a time at the end for questions too. So how about this second challenge, alignment? So when we talk about alignment here, what I mean is everyone's working in the same direction. Everyone's trying to accomplish the same thing. Right? And how we traditionally approach this in organizations is through managing, whether it's managing people, managing tasks, right, project managing. It's still the same overall approach. And what it effectively works out to is a team lead, an architect, a project manager comes in and they go and they help align people to whatever the plan is, right? I know that waterfall techniques of project management get a lot of flack for this, but the truth is it happens a lot in Scrum teams too, that there's someone going around saying, what task are you working on? Is this done? Is that done? Right? And it's still one person who's making it happen through extraordinary efforts. And one of the challenges with this is we're humans. It's not about just getting everyone on the line. They drift off too. Maybe someone asked you to do a quick favor that turned out to be a big problem, or you don't have the information that you need, and so you have to go run off and find it, and it's up to that person to go and bring things back together. So I want to talk about a different approach that's at the heart of Scrum. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to ask you all to participate in a really short exercise. I would like you to find the answer to this question and place it inside of the chat when you find it. So the question is, what is the only Major League Baseball team to never play in a World Series? That was fast. Anyone else? Yeah, so Seattle Mariners, right. So why did I do that? this is a really simple example of what we want to do when we want to create alignment without management. We want to start with a clear goal that everyone understands. So this was obviously a very simple goal, but my goal was to discover who is the only team who hasn't played in a World Series, right? Now, when we get into more complex things, I may also map out some of the constraints in our system. So I did say it's specifically an MLB team, so um, I'm not worried about other teams who play in leagues outside of the U.S. or outside of the major leagues in the U.S. I am not worried about this wasn't an issue, but I could have a constraint in here to say the only current team. In this case, it doesn't make a difference, but it might have made a difference. So I want to give people a view of where do I want to go to and what are my constraints. In real life, this might be what are our architectural standards? What are our branding standards? What is the thing that we're trying to accomplish and what are the lines you need to stay within? And at that point, I just let people go, right? And they'll find their own paths. We have an exercise that we do in classes a lot where we give people some slightly complex tasks to do and say, go do them. And they have no problem. They figure it out, they try a couple things and then they accomplish it. But then we ask someone to be a manager and say, I want you to tell people exactly what steps to go through. And it's a miserable experience for that poor person. Because when it comes to making really small adjustments to how to implement a solution, people are much better at figuring out those details on their own in the moment. And so Scrum offers a few pieces in its structure that really help you do this. So the very first is that lighthouse at the end. The sprint goal should describe a valuable business outcome that the team can use as a North Star for their sprint, right? So that was that question that I put out to you. And that might be something like, well, a lot of us are on Netflix a lot, so let's use Netflix as an example. Maybe I have a sprint goal that says, at the end of this sprint, a viewer of a TV series will be able to see exactly where they left off in that series. Obviously, Netflix has that now. At one point, they didn't, right? That would be a sprint goal because it doesn't tell us how to do it. It just says the outcome we want to get to. Too often, sprint goals are things like finish all these backlog items, right? Get all the work done. And that's not a very effective sprint goal if you need people to be able to make their own decisions as they go through. So the second thing plays on this. If I have that goal, now the team needs to use it. So the team members should develop a habit of making their own decisions by asking themselves, does this take me closer to the sprint goal? Or does this take me farther away from the sprint goal, right? So the first one creates the opportunity for this type of self-organization to occur. The second one creates the discipline for that self-organization not to become chaotic. And then the third one, and I put this third one in actually because it's the client I'm working with now has gotten huge benefit out of it. A lot of times backlog items become very task oriented. And when people need to be able to make decisions as we go, it's helpful to make them less task oriented, make them flexible enough to allow the team to coordinate their own implementation. So let's take an example here. I have a backlog item that says copy data from this R36 Form B into an earnings report. I see these kind of things in backlogs, especially when building medical software, banking software, tax software. We see this all the time. And ultimately, there's nothing horribly wrong with it. This is probably how it is going to be implemented, even if you write it differently. The challenge comes up when it turns out that there's a snag with this, that you say, well, it turns out we don't have security access to that, or only half of our stores in our company actually fill out this form. Now I'm stuck. And this gets right back into those communication problems. When I'm stuck, I kick something back up, they go and they take it to someone else, and all those slow communications just create more and more weight. So I can change it just a little bit. Show sales by product category and earnings report. We'll assume for a moment that's exactly what this form is supposed to show. But now I've given explicit permission to my teams to say, if the implementation you thought was going to work doesn't work, as long as you get this result, feel free to try another implementation. So So I want to tie this real quick back to the first challenge. All of these three things about alignment without management is about cutting down the number of times that people need to reach out to someone else to okay a decision for them. And this sprint goal, this way of making decisions, asking, am I getting closer to it or further away? And these flexible backlog items reduce the total number of communications, which reduces the time to go from effort to value. So they build on each other. And before I go to the third challenge, I'm just going to pause again and leave time if anyone has specific questions about these. So I see the question about size of stories. I'm actually going to defer to that one for just a moment because it comes in on challenge 3. So let's jump on to that. If I'm going a little too fast and you don't get a chance to get your question typed in, don't worry, finish typing it in and we will catch up on it. So this third challenge, adapting and pivoting. So what I mean by this, a lot of things are changing very fast. So we're not just, I mean, we all know, right? We're not just going remote because we all decided we want to stay at home more. It's because we're trying to deal with a huge global problem. And that global problem, in addition to making us move remote, is also causing us to make different business decisions very, very quickly. And again, with that alignment and that communication, adding more complexity into this, adapting and pivoting quickly is very, very difficult. It's difficult to do in the best of times, and it's very difficult now. So I want to explore why it's difficult and how we break that down. Usually when we approach this, a very common and sensible way of making decisions and planning something out is you look forward and you place a target. In June, by the 15th, I want these features done. I need these capabilities done. And then what I do is I draw a line from where I am right now to that target. And then I put a bunch of milestones down between here and there. This is not, I want to clarify that for many types of problem solving, this is not a bad way to approach a problem. In fact, it's a great way to approach a problem. But when we deal with really complex problems, it often doesn't get us there. I want everyone to take a moment, think about a project that you were working on that went off track. But think about when you knew it went off track and when the organization actually pivoted and made the change. So if you have that occurrence or that project in your head, here's what may have happened. You started moving through these milestones and different people in the project at different times. Right. Yeah. Well, okay, exactly. Sometimes they never change. And here's why. You start seeing things at different parts of the project at some of these different milestones here. And I should ask, on my screen share, does my mouse show up that I'm pointing to something? Okay, cool. Thank you. So right around maybe here or here, you think it was someone said sprint 2. So right around here, people start noticing things are off track. But there's a challenge, is that there's a motivation, there's a structural motivation that's built in that says if I go to here, I still did the right thing. I'm still moving towards this target. So now I have this cognitive dissonance where I'm doing the wrong thing from the standpoint of getting where I want to go, but I'm doing the right thing of doing my job properly. And this becomes a real challenge, and it causes people, this is where people follow this plan, sometimes all the way to the end, when they knew all the way back here that they were off track. And it's a very human, natural thing to do. It's a lot of times we get into these conversations and people just say, well, just don't say something. And they don't acknowledge the fact that you have a structure that's built to cause this dissonance, or more importantly, it's not built to cause the dissonance, but the way in which it is built causes the dissonance. And so Scrum says when you're tackling these kind of complex problems, take a different approach. We're going to use that lighthouse picture again, right? And instead of creating a target, I'm going to create a lighthouse. Now they're very similar because they are still a view out into the future. But I have an assumption that it's not where I'm going to end up. It's just the place I can see right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the first step. That's what I'm going to commit to. I'm going to commit to the first step in moving that direction. And once I take that step, two things are going to happen. One, I'm going to see an array of options for my second step. And I'm also going to get a different perspective on that place out in the distance. Instead of a fixed target, it's going to move a little bit because my perspective has moved a little bit. And based on my new perspective, I'm going to decide out of all of my options in front of me, what is the right next step to take? And I'm going to see the same thing play out. I have a few more options and it's going to move a little bit again. And this is going to play out sprint over sprint over sprint. And I'm going to keep taking these steps. And I will get closer and closer to my goal. And my goal will not be where I thought it was at the beginning of the project. And my path will not be what I think it is at the beginning of the project. This is, you can see here, we have this sort of wavy line. And I wanted to have that on the screen because I wanted to stress that this is not the most efficient way to get to a goal. But when you deal with complex problems, it is the effective way to get to a goal. So how do we do this in Scrum? Again, these are the challenges that Scrum is designed to solve, right? This is where it really, really thrives. So let me give an example for juxtaposition. If I'm figuring out how to file my taxes, I can go back to that straight line. I can get an expert and tell me the right way to file my taxes. That is not, you can use Scrum to do that, but its inefficiency will show through, right? Really, I should follow the steps I'm supposed to do to file my taxes. If I want to write a software package to make it fun and easy to file my taxes, well, no one knows the answer to that. How do you make taxes fun? That's tough, right? Now I have a complex problem. Now this is the approach that I need to take. And that's what Scrum is intended to do. So what are some of the concrete things in Scrum that we can do? One of them is we can make complete, potentially shippable increments every single sprint. A lot of teams don't do this. This just from my experience working with them, a lot of them just don't. And I want to draw a distinction here. There are the cases where a team doesn't know how to break down a big thing, where there are a lot of complexities to getting something done and they're not sure how to avoid those complexities. You learn that over time, right? You tackle problems and you go, oh, in hindsight, I could have tackled it this way. And next time I tackle a similar problem, I'll do it differently. I could learn from a coach. I could learn from my Scrum Master. I could learn from a more experienced team. When I say teams need to create complete, potentially shippable increments each sprint, I'm not thinking of that problem. That's a learning problem. What I'm thinking of is the problem where teams say, I didn't get it. I got 75% of my work done and that was a lot. I'll just pick it up next sprint. Because what's happening is they've already assumed the next sprint and where it's going to go. By not wrapping it up, by not trying to get a complete, potentially shippable increment, I am already anchoring into what my next step will be before I've even seen my options for my next steps and my new perspective on my target. The next thing is that in reviews and planning, teams and stakeholders should genuinely be considering what is the right work to do next. And this can just be a change of phrasing. A lot of teams do say, this is what's coming up in the next sprint or two. But we can change that phrase a little bit. So instead of saying this is what's coming up, this is what's at the top of our backlog. Does that seem right? Do other things seem like they should be at the top of the backlog instead? And if we take the time at the end of every sprint to have that conversation, even if it's just a 10-minute conversation, it can open up new options to us that we didn't see before. And then finally, what the team is doing, we should be doing all the way up the program. I've been in plenty of places that use Scrum in their teams, and their projects look just like this. They have, here's the big project we're going to work on first quarter. This is going to take us to the end of Q3, and this is going to take us into next year. And these big projects. And so even though this team could pivot, they won't, because the overall container is large and fixed. And so we can apply these exact same approaches at the program and portfolio level by starting with a little piece, a little slice of something that maybe a few teams can rally around and get it done in a sprint or two. And then just like with that lighthouse that we showed, we'll have a new perspective on what's important in the market, what's important in the changing world, and what are the next steps in front of us that we can take, and we can choose the best one. And then we can do that again over and over, and how our projects end up playing out look more like these tiny slices as opposed to like these big ones. And they might ultimately basically be the same projects in the end, but we're going to approach them in a more valuable way with the ability to pivot as our market changes around us. So I also want to tie this real quick back as we wrap up to the others. It's important to, this one is perhaps least about remote work, but it provides an important container. Right now, adapting and pivoting is critical. I think anyone who's in a leadership position in a business knows that's true. There are a lot of things changing every single day, and a decision that lasts a week might be too long. It's harder to do in a remote environment because we have these big decisions. It's harder to do it in a remote environment because it's hard to align, and it's harder to do in a remote environment because it's harder to communicate. So as we go through, these are 9 of the things that Scrum gives us that we can pick even 1 or 2 to double down on it, especially if it's a practice you already do and you could do more of, or you could do with more discipline, or you could get more value out of it. By doing that, it's going to make remote work a little bit easier for your organization. So that was the 3 challenges that I wanted to share with you. Before I open up for questions, I do want to say that if you want to dig deeper into this, if you want to talk about your specific context, please reach out to us. Let us know. Happy to talk about it and see where there might be help, or if we can just kind of point you in the right direction that you can run with it yourself. I'm going to open up for questions. I also have this here, which is just a view of all 9 of these. Like I said, these are 9 things that I'm actually doing with a real client right now who's facing these same challenges. And I put them up here because every single one of these is something that in the past couple of weeks they've done and they've seen value out of doing inside of their teams. And I hope even if only 1 or 2 of them apply to your teams, that applying those 1 or 2 will make your work life better. And with that, let's open up for questions.
Daniel, do you want to allow audio questions or just chat only?
Oh, sure. Let's do that.
So I think everybody can unmute themselves if they want. I can start you off with a question if you like.
Sure, go for it.
You were talking about size of team and then coordination of communication in teams. When we move to the virtual world with remote teams, what do you see happening to the size of teams? Bigger, smaller? What's good practice?
You know, so it's actually kind of funny. What I see happen is the teams get smaller regardless of how they're organized. Because communicating with a larger number of people becomes so much more difficult, people have a tendency to focus on the people that they really need. And so they try to grab a couple of people around them who they really need to get something out the door. And they sort of self-organize into some of these smaller 3 and 4 person teams. We ran into that. The organization I'm working with just said, hey, these are the problems we need to solve in the next 2 weeks. And we had a group of 10 people in a room, and it got a little chaotic. and they said, hey, 4 of us are leaving, we're forming our own group. And there you go, they're forming their own group, they're going to tackle this part of the problem, we're going to tackle this part of the problem with with our 6 people, and we'll sync up this often to make sure we're not doing duplicate work. And so a lot of that's happening organically. I think from a leadership standpoint, whether, and I say leadership, whether you're a manager or a tech lead, a scrum master, a senior developer, whatever leadership standpoint, I think the biggest thing that you can do there is not get in the way, right? Allow things to happen organically, but at the same time, see if you can be some of the glue that helps hold it together, right? Because so that it doesn't just become splintered groups, right? Again, that's back to that alignment. If you can provide some of the guide rails and the direction that people are going to go, then people will find their way inside of those guide rails. So I think I gave you a little bit more of the answer than you asked for, but they're definitely getting smaller. At least that's what I see, is that they're self-organizing in smaller groups.
I would agree, Daniel, and I was, interestingly, I just observed the same thing just this morning. And I've seen this lots of times as you go to a restaurant and you get a big group and you're sitting at a table and you watch the dinner conversation. And I've always been fascinated about how the people break into smaller groups of conversation naturally. It just happens automatically. That's what we do. And it's usually the people around us. However, sometimes the guy sitting right beside me will be talking to the people on the other side of him and he have his back turned to me. And so it doesn't, it's funny how it works. But anyway, I related that to a situation this morning where I was just talking with a team lead who was helping his team of 10 people, which is fairly sizable even by normal standards. And now they've been forced to work from home. Communication's been broken. And as he's trying to reconnect people, he said they automatically just started calling each other in groups of 3.
Yep.
So it evolved organically all by itself into much, much smaller groups, which was incredibly interesting, I thought, about how that happened all by itself. That's just the way people naturally communicate.
And I just want to point out something you said there in your example about dinner conversation, but sometimes you have cross conversations. And I think that's a really great place that team leaders, because they're out of the weeds a bit, they can see it happen. And they can be the person to go over there and go, hey guys, why don't you switch seats? Let's smooth this out a little bit. Right? That's a big thing that your tactical leaders, your team leads and things can do to really contribute in that situation. Any other questions from the group? So, go ahead.
Have you guys observed team or organizations where they were not using Scrum? They're not in software development, but they were mostly like a service or a product or a telco, for example. And now with this situation being forced on them, they have started using some of these practices from Scrum or from the Agile world. Any observations on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I can't say that I have observed that in this particular crisis that we're going through right now, but I used to work in an organization that was all hardware oriented and a lot of operations. So everything was operations, and they had some issues where they had to go into remote work, and I think some of these were still the case. Around alignment was still very common, and they found other ways to adapt that still were about shortening the cycle, right? Not looking too far out and having context that was far out, but making their decisions in very short steps. So I have seen that happen in that organization that I worked in. It's very operations oriented. A lot of maintaining infrastructure is what was happening there. And so it was like, okay, well, here's our end goal and here's our overall context that people can see. Um, here's the decision we're going to make for the next hour and a half or 2 hours in that case. And, but here's where we want to get to by the end of the day. And here's where we want to get to by the end of the week. So I think you see the principles come out.
Right.
On a webinar, I'd just be a little hesitant to be like, oh yeah, apply Scrum in there and have it not fit the context.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, and so I guess to that point, if you're in a situation where you're not solving, even if you're not solving complex problems, or you're just trying to deal with these same challenges, I would still look at some of the underlying principles. Hey, where are people, when they communicate, where are the most difficult communication channels, and why are those channels so difficult? Is it because of wait time, or you have a bottleneck, or the nature of that particular communication is overloaded? So I would look at the underlying reasons why on all of these, and kind of go back to that and see how they apply into your teams.
Daniel, any comment on story size?
Yeah, I'm trying to, let's make that concise. So my gut thing that I want to say is the smaller the better. You can take that too far, right?
Right.
But yeah, the whole idea inside of Agile is how small of a decision cycle can I make? How small of a step can I make that will tell me the next thing, so that if my goal shifts a lot or my circumstances shift a lot, I can take the right next step and not be committed far into it. I'm working with a team actually right now. In 2 hours, I have their first review. That their problem was so dynamic that any decision that would have played out in a 2-week sprint just seemed ridiculously long. And so for right at the moment, they've actually moved to 2-day sprints. So their backlog items are resolving in hours, right? Because they have to. It's a 2-day sprint, and they're learning things different from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. So the more complex your problem is, the more volatile your environment is, the shorter you want that decision step to be, which means the smaller your backlog items are going to be.
Right. Yeah, I think I'm seeing the same kind of thing. Organizations that have really big teams and really long sprints and really large stories are struggling more to operate in this environment. But the organizations that already have small teams, small stories, shorter sprints, they seem to be able to react faster naturally, because that's by design. It's happened that way. But if they've already practiced that and are fairly good at it, they're adapting more easily to this new environment.
Yep. And I think that there is a notion out there of like, oh no, if I haven't put the work in already, it's too late. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to put these 9 items up, is that the truth is most of us don't work in organizations that have all this in place and perfect, and they're just ready to run. And so hopefully these 9 items give everyone at least one thing that they look at and say, hey, that's interesting. My teams don't wrap up their sprints, or our sprint goals are very focused on just completing the work in the sprint. And it gives you something that you can anchor onto, and putting even one of these in place can alleviate some of that pain point. And once one of them's in place, sometimes some of the others become very easy to put in right after. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, we can break. Again, thank you everyone for joining, especially those of you who are into your evening and took your time to come and attend this webinar. Really appreciate it. All of the recording for this and the slides for this will be posted later in this afternoon, so in the next couple of hours. So they'll be available to you to access for reference later on. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.